Ever wanted to see a real-life economic train wreck? I'm talking about a full-blown financial disaster movie, starring mismanagement, imperial arrogance, and a level of chaos that would make anyone's head spin. Well, then let's travel back in time to the North American colonies, just before 1764. Honestly, it was a masterpiece of dysfunction. The colonies were these ambitious little outposts, trying to build a new world. But they had one tiny problem. They were completely broke. I don't mean I can't afford avocado toast broke. I mean a systemic, bone-deep absence of actual money. Gold and silver, the lifeblood of 18th century trade, avoided the colonies like the plague. Any precious metal that did show up seemed to immediately book a one-way ticket straight back to Britain. Why? The colonists were fantastic customers for British goods stools, textiles, you name it, but they weren't exporting enough to balance the books. This created a constant drain of cash, leaving the local economy gasping for air. So, how did people buy things? Well, it was like an economic scavenger hunt. Barter became the name of the game. Farmers traded grain for tools, and carpenters exchanged their labor for livestock. It sounds charming, right? But if you're trying to build a modern economy, it's a total nightmare. You'd think the British Empire might step in and help, but nope. The official policy from London was basically, you're on your own. The colonies weren't allowed to mint their own coins or print money without a dozen strings attached. It was like tying someone's hands behind their back and then being shocked when they QEN open a door. But the colonists were resourceful. If they couldn't get gold and silver, they'd just make their own money. Colonial governments started issuing paper bills of credit. These weren't backed by gold, but by trust and the promise of future taxes. For a while, it actually worked. This paper money filled the gap and kept local businesses running. It was a messy solution, but it was a solution. Of course, this is where it gets messy. British creditors were not amused. They had lent money expecting to be paid back in stable British currency, not some colonial paper that could lose its value overnight. And it did. Inflation was a huge problem. A pound from Massachusetts might not be worth the same as a pound from Virginia, and both could be worthless tomorrow. Britain's response, predictably, they freaked out. The idea of these provincial colonists playing with monetary policy was infuriating to the powerful people in London. To them, it seemed like the colonists were just messing with their profits. But even with all this tension, life went on. Colonists were walking a financial tightrope, balancing between a severe lack of hard currency and their own unstable paper money. They didn't see it yet, but this economic hardship was planting the seeds of something much bigger. All this financial stress was making people question the whole system. Why should London control their money? Why were trade rules designed only to benefit British merchants? People started realizing that the empire didn't see them as partners, but as assets to be squeezed for profit. And here's the biggest irony. The colonists weren't trying to start a rebellion. They just wanted an economy that worked. They wanted to be able to trade, work, and live without constantly fearing bankruptcy. But empires have a bad habit of ignoring warning signs. London figured all this grumbling across the ocean was just noise that would eventually die down. They didn't realize they were creating the very conditions for a massive storm. They were teaching the colonists a powerful lesson. Whoever controls the money controls your destiny. The year 1764 was just around the corner. A single act of Parliament was about to turn this simmering frustration into a full-blown crisis. The economic struggles that Britain had ignored for so long were about to ignite a fire that would change the world forever. Imagine you're trying to put out a fire, but instead of water, you grab a can of gasoline. That's pretty much what the British Empire did to the North American colonies in 1764. Before then, the colonies were already in a financial mess. They were short on hard currency axle, gold and silver coins, and were improvising with paper money just to keep their economies from grinding to a halt. It was chaotic, but it was working. Barely. Then, London decided to fix the problem. In classic imperial fashion, they passed the Currency Act of 1764. The logic was, shall we say, unique. The colonies were issuing paper money because they had no other money. So, What did Britain do? They banned the colonies from issuing any more paper money as legal tender. It's like solving a drought by outlawing rain. Why would they do this? Well, the official story was all about protecting the British financial system and ensuring stable currency. It sounded very noble, but the real reason was much simpler. British merchants were tired of being paid in colonial paper money, which wasn't worth as much as their shiny British pounds. To protect their rich investors from the slightest inconvenience, Parliament decided to drop an economic bomb on the colonies. On September 1st, 1764, the hammer fell. No new paper money could be issued, and existing bills were no longer legal for paying taxes or debts. Imagine waking up one day and being told the money in your wallet is basically just decorative paper. That's what happened. For farmers, merchants, and local governments, it was a catastrophe. Businesses couldn't get credit, debtors couldn't pay their bills, and the entire colonial economy began to suffocate. Meanwhile, back in London, officials were patting themselves on the back. They saw the colonists as irresponsible children who couldn't be trusted with their own money. Parliament had stepped in, like a stern parent, to restore order. They completely missed the point that paper money wasn't a reckless gamble. It was a lifeline. It was the only thing keeping the economy moving in a region constantly drained of gold and silver. A few smart people, like Benjamin Franklin, tried to warn them. Franklin was in London and pleaded with officials, explaining over and over that the colonies needed paper money to survive. But who was he? Just a colonist. What could he possibly know? Parliament ignored him, confident in their own superior wisdom. Their arrogance was only matched by their ignorance of the situation on the ground. The impact was immediate and devastating. Economic activity stalled. People faced lawsuits and foreclosure. But more than just the economic pain, the Currency Act planted a dangerous seed of distrust. Colonists started to see that Britain didn't care about their well-being. London's priority was extracting wealth, not supporting growth. It wasn't just a bad monetary policy. It was a political statement. It was a declaration that the colonies were subordinate, that their fate was to be decided by a distant government that didn't understand or care about their reality. This act transformed frustration into genuine anger. People who had once believed in the fairness of the British system began to have serious doubts. They wondered, if the empire could so casually destroy their economy, what other rights would they come for next? Britain thought it was tightening its grip on the colonies, but in reality, it was pushing them away. The Currency Act didn't bring control. It provoked defiance. It didn't create stability. It fueled resistance. The British had mistaken a tool for economic regulation and turned it into a spark for revolution, and they had no idea what they had just set in motion. If Part 2 explained how the Opium War started, Part 3 will show you how they triggered a financial shockwave that rewired the entire world. These weren't just regional conflicts. They were an accelerant for global economic forces that had been building for centuries. Their true impact wasn't just in treaties or trade routes. It was in central banking, the flow of money, and even the psychology of empire itself. To understand this, we need to see the 19th century world as a single, interconnected financial ecosystem, one whose center of gravity was about to shift dramatically. The shockwave that erupted from China rippled through London, Calcutta, Hong Kong, and New York, leaving patterns that still shape our world today. For centuries, China was the world's silver sink. Spanish galleons, Indian merchants, European trading houses, they all funneled the precious metal into the Middle Kingdom. Silver was the backbone of the Qing economy, used for taxes, land, and credit. But by the 1830s, this system was cracking. The British solution, exporting Indian-grown opium, was more than a trade strategy. It was a monetary weapon. As opium addiction spread, silver poured out of China at a terrifying rate. Between 1820 and 1840, the country's silver reserves plunged, creating a deflationary spiral. Prices fell, debt soared, and the Qing treasury, already strained, could no longer stabilize its own currency. This was the first great lesson of the Opium Wars, when a nation's monetary foundation crumbles. Even the strongest empires become vulnerable. While China bled silver, Britain thrived on the imbalance. The profits from the opium trade didn't just enrich a few merchants. They cemented the British Empire as the world's financial core. Sterling, backed by industrial might and imperial trade, became the dominant global currency. By the end of the century, over 60% of world trade was financed through London banks. Opium profits also paid for new shipping fleets, the administration of India, and the growth of hubs like Singapore and Hong Kong. The wars institutionalized a new model of empire. Instead of occupying vast territories, Britain controlled the financial gateways, the ports, customs, and tariffs. It turned geopolitics into a game of financial architecture. The treaties that ended the wars carved open a network of treaty ports across China. These weren't just entry points for goods. They were laboratories for a new kind of global capitalism. Shanghai, in particular, became a bustling center of finance, hosting foreign banks, joint stock companies, and even futures markets. It was here that China first encountered modern financial tools like bills of exchange and international credit. This system, built on standardized contracts, convertible currencies, and enforceable laws, laid the groundwork for the 20th century financial order. In a way, the principles tested in Shanghai would later influence the creation of the IMF and the US dollar's role as the world's reserve currency. While Britain and China clashed, another nation was watching closely. The United States. American merchants quickly understood that China was the world's largest untapped market. The Opium Wars signaled to Washington that Asia was essential to America's future. This sparked a vision for China trade that would lead to the open door policy, and it demonstrated that economic access required naval power. Within decades, the U.S. Navy began expanding into the Pacific, a move that would shape everything from the annexation of Hawaii to the outcome of World War II. The seeds of today's economic rivalry between the U.S. and China were planted right here, in the ashes of the Opium Wars. For the Qing dynasty, the financial fallout was catastrophic. Massive indemnities drained its treasury. The loss of control over tariffs crippled its revenue. The internal chaos created the perfect storm for rebellion, most devastatingly the Taiping Rebellion, which cost tens of millions of lives and shattered what was left of the economy. Here lies the great irony. The Opium Wars didn't directly overthrow the Qing, created the financial instability that made its collapse inevitable. Across Asia, nations learned a harsh lesson. Whoever controls the flow of currency controls the future. Japan learned fastest. Witnessing China's humiliation, the Meiji leadership rapidly modernized its industry, banking, and tax systems. Within a few decades, Japan became Asia's first industrial power, while China remained trapped in financial fragmentation. But the deepest legacy is psychological. For China, the wars marked the beginning of its century of humiliation. This historical memory still shapes its policies today. Its strive for currency sovereignty, its massive foreign reserves, and its push for alternative global payment systems. The Opium Wars turned China into a nation obsessed with financial security, determined to never again let foreign powers dictate its economic destiny. Did the Opium Wars just bankrupt an empire? Well, not exactly. The real story is far more complex and much more devastating. While our last episode covered the global shockwaves, today we're going deep into the heart of China, where the consequences of defeat and forced trade sparked a financial firestorm that would unravel a 2,000-year-old dynasty. Imagine a government suddenly unable to pay its bills. That's what happened to the Qing. After the First Opium War, the treaty demanded 21 million silver dollars in payment. This was just the beginning. With each new conflict, more silver flowed out of China, creating a severe shortage. For the average farmer, this was a disaster. They sold their crops for cheap copper coins, but had to pay their taxes in increasingly scarce and expensive silver. It was a debt trap that swallowed entire villages. The military wasn't spared either. With the treasury empty, soldiers went unpaid. Many deserted or joined private militias, loyal only to whoever could feed them. The empire's own army was turning against it. Meanwhile, the bureaucracy ground to a halt. Officials couldn't fund disaster relief or maintain vital infrastructure. The once mighty Qing state was being strangled from within. This widespread economic pain created a powder keg, and the Taiping Rebellion was the match that lit the fuse. Often seen as a religious uprising, it was fundamentally fueled by financial desperation. Peasants who lost their land, merchants with ruined businesses, and unpaid soldiers all flocked to the Taiping banner. At its peak, The rebellion controlled a territory larger than France, with its own treasury and tax system. To fight this massive internal war, the Qing government made a fateful decision. It allowed regional governors to raise their own armies, like Zheng Fan's famous Xiang army. While this helped defeat the Taiping, it came at a huge cost. Power shifted from the central government in Beijing to these new regional strawmen. China was no longer a unified empire, but a collection of armed provinces. Just as the Qing were battling for survival internally, Britain and France returned for round 2 in the Second Opium War. Facing a two-front war, the Qing were utterly over. The treaties that followed were catastrophic. The indemnities were enormous. Opium was fully legalized, accelerating the silver drain, and foreign merchants were now allowed to travel deep into China's interior, disrupting local economies. But the most damaging blow was the loss of control over their own customs service. Foreigners, mostly British, were put in charge of collecting China's tariffs. This meant a huge chunk of the empire's revenue was now managed by external powers. China had lost a key part of its economic sovereignty. While the imperial government withered, the coastal treaty ports like Shanghai exploded with wealth. Foreign banks, shipping companies, and industries created a modern, thriving economy. But this wealth didn't flow to the Qing treasury. It stayed in foreign hands or funded these isolated pockets of modernity. By the 1870s, China had 2 separate economies: a booming, foreign-dominated coastal system and a collapsing, impoverished interior. Some officials saw the writing on the wall and launched the self-strengthening movement, an attempt to adopt Western technology while preserving Chinese traditions. They built arsenals, shipyards, and schools. But the effort was doomed. Funding was fragmented, conservative officials resisted change, and foreign powers blocked any reforms that threatened their own profits. The loss of tariff control was the final nail in the coffin. While other nations like Japan used tariffs to protect their industries and fund modernization, China was stuck with a flat 5% rate imposed by the West. It couldn't raise revenue or protect its own businesses. By the end of the 19th century, the Qing Empire was a failing state. Its finances were in ruins. Its military was fractured, and its legitimacy was gone. The financial chaos unleashed by the Opium Wars had set the stage for the final collapse of Imperial China and the birth of a new, uncertain future. What happens when this broken empire finally shatters? We'll explore that in our next episode. If the story of the Qing Empire's decline was a slow, agonizing crack, this is the part where the entire structure shatters. We're not just talking about the fall of a dynasty. We're talking about a complete systemic unraveling, where financial ruin, military humiliation, and political paralysis all converged at once. Irony! The very financial pressures foreign powers used to exploit China would ultimately destroy the political order they wanted to control. This is the moment where every fracture line meets, marking the end of Imperial China and the chaotic birth of the modern nation. By the late 19th century, the Qing treasury was a sinking ship. Foreign-controlled customs siphoned off the empire's best income, sending it overseas to pay off debts before it could even feed its own people. Worse still were the indemnities, massive payments forced on China after losing wars to Britain, France, and Japan. The government was trapped, borrowing new money just to pay the interest on old loans. It was a fiscal treadmill with no off switch. As Beijing went broke, provincial governors started keeping tax revenues for themselves, funding their own armies, and ignoring the emperor. The Qing court was a hollow shell grown in ceremony, but financially powerless. The final nail in the coffin was the Boxer Protocol of 1901. After an international army stormed Beijing to crush the Boxer Rebellion, China was handed a bill for 450 million taels of silver, with interest. The total came to nearly 1 billion taels, almost 3 times the empire's entire annual revenue. To guarantee payment, China had to sign over its most vital income sources: the maritime customs, internal customs, and the salt tax. The government lost all control over its own finances. Foreign troops were now permanently stationed in the capital, an occupation paid for by the Chinese treasury itself. China was no longer a sovereign nation, not even in its own capital. Shocked into action, the Qing court launched a series of desperate reforms. They created modern schools, new ministries, and even provincial assemblies. They also built a new, Western-style military called the Beiyang Army. On paper, it looked like progress, but this new army's loyalty was to its commander, Yuan Shikai, not the emperor. In trying to build a tool to save the dynasty, the Qing had actually forged the weapon that would be used to destroy it. The reforms were too little, too late, and only highlighted how little authority the government actually had. As political chaos mounted, the monetary system completely imploded. Imagine an economy with no single currency. Mexican silver dollars, Japanese yen, and British trade dollars competed with local banknotes and copper coins. Each region had its own exchange rates. This chaos, combined with the massive amounts of silver being shipped out of the country to pay indemnities, caused prices to swing wildly and crushed the rural population under impossible tax burdens. A government that cannot control its own money is finished. The Qing had reached that point, so when the Xinhai Revolution broke out in 1911, no one was surprised. One by one, provinces declared their independence, no longer trusting Beijing to manage their affairs. All eyes turned to Yuan Shikai and the Beiyang Army. Instead of defending the throne, Yuan played both sides. He negotiated with the revolutionaries and then went to the imperial court, demanding the emperor's abdication as the price for a peaceful transition. On February 12, 1912, the child emperor Pui ebbed. After more than 2,000 years, the Chinese monarchy was over, ending not with a bang, but with a pen stroke. Ultimately, the Opium Wars didn't just defeat the Qing militarily, they destroyed its financial sovereignty. They drained its silver, crippled its tax system, and replaced national wealth with national debt. The fall of the empire didn't bring peace. It unleashed a century of chaos. The warlord era, Japanese invasion, and civil war. But all of it can be traced back to this moment when a great civilization lost control of its money, and in doing so, lost control of its destiny. The echoes of that collapse of debt, diplomacy, and economic coercion are still felt in our world today.